In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks. Doing hard time for these WikiLeaks. Trying to bring the truth out, man, it only gets you heat. And then they gag you. You don't get to speak. And when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masters of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people up the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger.
Kill the messenger. Kill the messenger. Kill the messenger.
In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks. Doing hard time for these WikiLeaks. Trying to bring the truth out, man, it only gets you heat. And then they gag you. You don't get to speak. And when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masters of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular,
You kill the messenger.
free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor,
Kill the messenger.
outside my window, a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I released 7 vaults, they upset, they under the rape sentence. But the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. And okay to Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Darkness.
Feeling cold now, I got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate light. Wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's your mom? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's Free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, counting days like brake lights, 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 brake lights.
Welcome to the 20th Unity for J online vigil for WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss, Editor-in-Chief of Disobedient Media.
Julian Assange is a wanted man because he's published classified information given to him by whistleblowers that has revealed the crimes and corruption of government officials around the world, and particularly in the United States.
The US, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy around the globe, wants him extradited to the United States for the crime of publishing. Assange has interfered with the interests of some of the most powerful people in the world by revealing their hidden deeds to the public.
Those powerful interests want him to pay. That's why Julian Assange has been a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years. He knows that the moment he steps outside that embassy onto British territory, he'll be arrested and most likely sent to the US, where he will probably not receive a fair trial and could spend the rest of his life in prison.
It is a historic test of press freedom. The corporate media, which once profited from him, has now abandoned Julian Assange, and they could face the same threat to their freedom to publish classified information were he to be arrested and tried.
Now, the headlines of the past week in regard to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks: Chelsea Manning, who was, of course, the source for the collateral murder video, which we showed last week, the Afghan war logs, the State Department cables. Chelsea Manning has been in jail now for 1 week here in Alexandria, Virginia, where I am, for refusing to testify to a grand jury that's investigating WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. German members of the Bundestag on the left came out to oppose last Friday's jailing of Manning by posing for photographs, 20 of them, holding placards that say, "I stand with Chelsea" and "Solidarity with Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks." Kristen Huffington, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, tweeted, "Every day Chelsea Manning spends in jail for refusing to testify against Assange and WikiLeaks adds shame to those journalists who remain silent about this disgrace. This applies especially to those who benefited most from her brave acts in the past." At The Guardian, at New York Times. We'll be talking a lot more about Chelsea as this program continues.
Another headline this week was that the UK police were revealed to have shared information about WikiLeaks and its journalists with the US government for at least 4 years between 2013 and 2017, as US prosecutors conducted secret investigations into WikiLeaks and its editor, Julian Assange. Computer Weekly wrote that the Met Police collaborated with US prosecutors and that they shared information about WikiLeaks for at least 4 years as the DOJ conducted the secret investigations that we know, as Joe was just talking about, Chelsea Manning has been held in contempt for not participating in.
The Trump nominee for ambassador to Ecuador, Michael J. Fitzpatrick, made threats against Julian Assange in response to questions from Senator Marco Rubio during his confirmation hearings. And I would like to be able to show that by right now, if I can set that up. I want to show these are the remarks that were made by Fitzpatrick.
I am deeply concerned about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks' hostile activities and intent to undermine U.S. democracy and national security. That's a problem, and letting it drag on much longer would continue to harm our interests, and I believe harm Ecuador's interests as well. In the fall, a number of additional restrictions were placed on him, including restricting his access to the internet. He is still officially the publisher of WikiLeaks, and we still hold him responsible for what WikiLeaks does.
Well, that's quite chilling.
Restricting his access to the internet.
America is probably the next ambassador to Ecuador from the United States. For what WikiLeaks does, they hold them responsible. What does WikiLeaks do? They reveal crimes and corruption. That's what WikiLeaks does, and that's what they don't want WikiLeaks to do anymore. Elizabeth?
Yeah, and following that, we also saw that free speech groups have now come out in support of WikiLeaks and its move to dismiss the DNC lawsuit against the publisher. Bloomberg published an article titled "Free Speech Groups Support WikiLeaks' Move to Dismiss the DNC Lawsuit," writing that a trio of free speech groups urged a U.S. judge to dismiss a lawsuit filed against WikiLeaks by the Democratic National Committee over the disclosure of private DNC information, arguing that the published material, even if acquired illegally, is protected by the First Amendment. And the suit was filed by the DNC last April, accusing Russian intelligence of hacking into computers, penetrating its telephone systems, gaining access to tens of thousands of documents and emails, and releasing them through WikiLeaks and other methods. the DNC also alleged that President Donald Trump's campaign organization conspired with WikiLeaks, a claim Trump has denied. And I might add that there is no evidence for whatsoever.
WikiLeaks lawyers, Julian Assange's lawyers, have responded to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the decision they made. Unfortunately, I don't have that in front of me. So Elizabeth, if you can you please read the statement that they put out, Assange's lawyers?
It looks like that's not showing up in my document.
Well, actually, I do have it right now. Sorry for the confusion. This is the press statement by Julian Assange's defense on the Inter-American Commission communication to the parties regarding the proceedings against Ecuador. What the court or the commission ruled was the following. This is the statement. The IHCHR says that the principle of non-refoulement is imperative and applies in full, and the defense awaits the decision concerning precautionary measures with respect to the United States. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, having received information from both parties, has forcefully declared to Ecuador in its proceedings concerning precautionary measures that Ecuador has the international obligation not to surrender Assange to a country where his person is at risk, the United States, or any other third state from which the journalist is at risk of subsequently being sent to the United States, the United Kingdom. The Inter-American Commission states clearly that the principle of non-refoulement, that is to send him back to another country, take him out of refugee status, is imperative and applies in full. Ecuador is obligated by the decision of the Inter-American Commission to protect Julian Assange, to not surrender him to the United States or to a third state that could send him to that country, and indeed to guarantee his rights as an asylee. This obligation requires that Mr. Assange be treated humanely as per the instructions of the UN Human Rights Council's Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Julian Assange's defense team is awaiting the decision concerning precautionary measures with respect to the United States, where recent reports have attested to the fact that the United States has criminally charged Julian Assange in secret, a situation that sets a dangerous precedent for freedom of the press globally.
And as we mentioned last week, Chelsea Manning has been subpoenaed, and the New York Times wrote that Chelsea Manning, the former Army intelligence analyst convicted in 2013 of leaking archives of secret military and diplomatic documents of WikiLeaks, revealed in an interview that she had been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury and vowed to fight it. The subpoena did not say what prosecutors intend to ask her about, but it was issued in the Eastern District of Virginia after prosecutors inadvertently disclosed in November that Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, had been charged under seal in that district. Ms. Manning, who provided a copy of the subpoena to the New York Times, said that her legal team would file a motion on Friday to quash it, which, as we know, was not successful, arguing that it would violate her constitutional rights to force her to appear. She declined to say whether she would cooperate if that failed. Given what is going on, I'm opposing this, she said. I want to be very forthright that I have been subpoenaed. I don't know the parameters of the subpoena apart from that I'm expected to appear. I don't know when I'm going to be asked. And I think it's good to go over this again so that we bring people up to speed. Definitely. We also heard that Joshua Steve, a spokesman for the Office of the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, or EDVA, declined to comment, but there are multiple reasons to believe that the subpoena is related to the investigation of Mr. Assange.
We have some news about Tulsi Gabbard.
Right. The Heavy wrote that Tulsi Gabbard, the 2020 presidential candidate who is running in the DNC primary, posted on Facebook today speaking out against the US government's treatment of WikiLeaks, saying it would have a chilling effect on investigative reporting. This was a follow-up to previous comments she's made to a similar effect. Today, she wrote on Facebook, quote, "If the government can change the designation of WikiLeaks from being a news organization, the Obama administration's designation of WikiLeaks, to a, quote, hostile intelligence service, which was the Trump administration's designation, then any entity, online and offline, is in danger of being designated a hostile intelligence agency if they carry out investigative reporting that the US government or a particular administration considers to be hostile to itself. This will have a chilling effect on investigative reporting of powerful government agencies or officials, including the president, intelligence agencies, etc. This is a serious breach of our constitutional freedoms, and every American, Democrat, Republican, or Independent, must stand up against it." And that was the end of the quote from Tulsi Gabbard. And you can find that statement, I believe, still on her Facebook page.
Extraordinary coming from a presidential candidate in the United States. Finally, we look to Venezuela, where Max Blumenthal, from writing for Gray Zone, in which we also republished at Consortium News, refers to a September 2010 memo that happened to be published by WikiLeaks. And as Elizabeth was saying to me before we went on the air, these documents that come out years ago can pop up in unusual ways and refer to a current situation, and that situation is Venezuela. This September 2010 memo, Max Blumenthal writes, by a US-funded soft power organization that helped train Venezuelan coup leader Juan Guaido and his allies, identifies the potential collapse of the country's electoral sector as, quote, a watershed event that, quote, would likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate. So this WikiLeaks published document from 2010 shows that this group that was training Guaido talked openly about the electoral sector, the electricity of the country is being shut down as a way to galvanize public unrest. Of course, as everyone knows, last week in Venezuela, about 80%, I believe, of the electricity went down. The Venezuelan government claims that it was indeed a cyber attack. They blamed the United States for this. They said they worked to restore the electricity, and they came under another attack. Of course, the United States denies this. In fact, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, had a pretty awful tweet in which he said, no electricity, no food, and soon no Maduro. I'm paraphrasing, but it was just a completely insensitive remark to make because people actually died as a result of that power failure. So we're going to talk now mostly, at the beginning at least, about Chelsea Manning. Before we do that, I just want to mention that this Inter-American Commission ruling that Assange cannot be kicked out of the embassy is unfortunately not legally binding on Ecuador, nor would any ruling be illegally binding on the United States. This commission only has the right to demand cooperation from countries, and they'll make strong recommendations. It's politically useful. It's a victory for Assange that this decision was made, but the United States and Ecuador cannot be forced to do what any branch of the OAS can say. Only the UN Security Council of any international organization really, as an enforcement mechanism, can actually use military force to enforce their resolutions. So I was returned last night, flying all night back from the west coast of the US here to Alexandria, where Chelsea Manning is in prison tomorrow, Saturday, in front of the White House at Lafayette Park. There'll be a rally about Venezuela and about WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning. I'll be speaking there tomorrow. And of course, the issue about Chelsea Manning is quite an extraordinary one. I met with Dan Ellsberg when I was out in the San Francisco area yesterday. And of course, he's all over this because he sees himself in someone like Chelsea Manning. And Dan asked me how many people he thinks would have decided to go to jail rather than just answer some questions in a grand jury. I told Dan that I thought that he would be better qualified to answer that question than I, and he objected to that. So I said, not many people would. Elizabeth, she has put herself back into prison after 7 years she spent in prison, rather than face this secret grand jury, to go over most likely the same questions she was asked during her trial, her military court-martial. And the main question was whether Assange or anyone at WikiLeaks actively participated with her in the stealing of these classified documents, whether to instruct her, to give her a list, to encourage her. And she said then, and she said she would say again, that it was totally her decision and she takes full responsibility for doing this. So she did not want to go over this again. And as I spoke with Dan about this, it appears first of all, I think, Elizabeth, I don't know if you agree with me, that the silver lining in this is they don't have enough yet maybe to indict Assange. This grand jury has been impaneled and re-impaneled, and it can be as many times as they need it since 2010 for what we understand. And they're still looking for more. And what I think they want from her is indeed some kind of evidence that Assange took part in the theft of the documents because they don't want to try him only on what the Espionage Act would allow them to do, which is his mere possession of classified information and then dissemination of it. That is illegal under the Espionage Act. That has never been challenged in court. They could probably count on, if they got him on that and they charged him on the Espionage Act under that provision of the act, that would be challenged, and it could lose in a First Amendment case, and that could be struck out of the act because it seems to really have the government stifle freedom of the press. The government could argue that in the Pending on Papers case, the Supreme Court majority decided that yes, the Constitution forbids the government from telling a newspaper or any media outlet that they cannot publish something, but that after publication, there can be prosecution. That is what was held then, but no government has ever done that. So it seems clear to me that they want to get her to implicate Assange so that they don't have to go down that road, which would lead to a First Amendment challenge by any number of organizations would sue them on that. I just wonder what you think.
No, absolutely. I agree. And I think that it makes a horrible kind of sense that they definitely seem to be resistant to prosecuting him as a journalist. So they're trying to recast him as somebody who was actively involved in the actual stealing of these documents. That definitely seems to be the thrust of the issue as far as what Chelsea Manning was refusing to answer questions about. And I think that, as you mentioned, yes, it's extraordinary that she was willing to go back into a situation she's faced before, just, based on what she felt was right. And I think that she's just an incredible human being that way. I mean, not only is that a moral stand in and of itself, but again, the bravery of going into that situation when you've already been there, I think definitely adds a level of courage that I think is extremely rare.
Yeah, we want to bring James Cogan in here. He is where are you, James? In Sydney, right? If you unmute your microphone, please. There you go.
I got it.
Yes, so I'm in Sydney.
And you are what is your title again? I'm sorry, you're the president or executive?
National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia and a correspondent for the World Socialist website. My audio's okay, is it?
Yes, that's fine.
We love the signs you have behind your head as well.
Well, that's obviously new posters we've issued in the wake of the return to, or the re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning. The cases of the two, of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, are clearly inextricably linked, as you were just discussing. Chelsea Manning is back in a prison cell for refusing to take part in a sordid attempt by the American state to force her to give false testimony against Assange. And as you were just discussing, the sole aim being to try to get around the problem they've had since 2010, which is if you prosecute WikiLeaks for the publication of the damning information provided by Chelsea Manning, then it raises the issue of the prosecution of the New York Times, The Guardian, La Paz, Le Monde, the Sydney Morning Herald, and numerous other publications who actively worked with WikiLeaks to prepare and publish the information in 2010. So, as you were just discussing, the clear intent is to instead try to prosecute Assange as essentially for obtaining the leaks, for conspiracy, in other words.
He certainly did get classified information that he was not authorized to have. That's a violation of a section of the Espionage Act. But as you point out, James, it happens every day, pretty much, in the New York Times and
well, that is journalism. That's the bread and butter of investigative journalism. Every major exposure which is being carried out of government criminality, of corporate criminality, and so on, has required the defiance of laws set up to protect the interest of government and big business. There are, the efforts to criminalise independent media, independent journalism, is proceeding apace. The statement that you played from the newly installed or upcoming Ecuadorian US ambassador to Ecuador is chilling. He made more or less a threat to that the Ecuadorian government, if the interest of the Ecuadorian government is to end the asylum of Julian Assange inside the London embassy, it underscores what is at stake in the political campaign and fight that is being developed internationally, such as through this forum, such as through the rallies we just conducted in Australia, such as the rallies which are taking place now at American colleges, and the event that you referred to, which is taking place, when is it, tomorrow in Washington? Saturday. Yeah. But so, yes, there are enormous questions at stake, and it again underscores the utter complicity of so many organisations and individuals who are refusing, in the face of all the attempts to say that the pursuit of Julian Assange was over the suspicions raised by Swedish prosecutors or over something to do with the 2016 election. This is all just exposed as utter rubbish. The entire pursuit of WikiLeaks, as that ambassador made clear, is bound up with what WikiLeaks published in 2010 and what it has published since. He didn't say it, but it was a fairly clear reference to Vault 7 and the ongoing work of WikiLeaks as one of the main repositories for whistleblowers to get information out to the world. And there is nothing more important under conditions where militarism is escalating, where geostrategic tensions are developing, where war threatens, where you have regime change operations being prepared. There is nothing more important than whistleblowers being able to get information out to the working class, to the broad mass of the population. So what does that mean?
It just said that there was a request to turn up your volume. You sound fine to me, but apparently for some people it's a bit low.
I'll just put the mic closer to me.
Oh, for Joe. Sorry, it was for Joe.
Okay, all right.
No worries.
All right. Well, yeah. So that's, I think, the coordinated, collaborative efforts to sort of develop, a political campaign for Assange now clearly has to raise centrally the banner of Chelsea Manning as well. As I said, their cases are inextricably linked. You cannot, Manning has been told she will remain in a prison cell until the grand jury ceases its its indictment, essentially, of Julian Assange.
Or until she decides to testify. Which, as WikiLeaks tweeted, it's literally a coercive measure to force her to give testimony that she refused to give. Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And I think if WikiLeaks, as you and Joe were saying a few minutes ago, obtaining or and having, being in possession of secret classified information, which is illegal to technically handle and deal with, is a mainstay of journalism. But the difference between WikiLeaks and something like the New York Times or the Guardian is that WikiLeaks has been so, uniquely effective in its journalism that's why we're facing this, legal response to WikiLeaks that we have not seen and will not see when it comes to something like what the New York Times publishes or the Guardian publishes on a regular basis.
Yeah, that was the power of what was done in 2010. There was no attempt by WikiLeaks to vet it, to censor it, to edit it out. Obviously they took precautions about them to the extent that was necessary, but they provided the raw data in the words of the US state agencies themselves, especially the diplomatic cables, which had a transformative effect in world politics. People were, everyone's well aware in that sense of what, that all sorts of sordid conspiracy goes on behind the scenes, but to actually have it in black and white in the actual cables is a different matter. For example, in Australia, we were very, very, from the outset, deeply convinced that the US embassy had some sort of a role in the ousting of an elected prime minister. In December 2010, diplomatic cables were published, which proved it. A large section of the Labor Party in Australia are what were openly described as protected sources and operatives of the American embassy. And similar revelations obviously were made regarding dozens of countries such as Tunisia and like elsewhere.
Yeah, no, I don't think you can emphasize enough the importance of the documents that Chelsea Manning was, the source for the publication of. Like the impact of the breadth of these cables cannot be underscored enough, really. Joe, did you want to add any thoughts on that?
If all one has to do is start reading all those cables. I mean, I was based at UN headquarters for a very long time, 25 years, and I was there when those diplomatic cables came out. There was quite a lot about the UN in there, particularly the US was trying to get biometric data on Ban Ki-moon, who was Secretary General at the time. So they were trying to get, skin scrapings or anything they could to get him. They wanted this type of spying was going on. Of course, everyone knows everyone spies on one another at the UN. And as James pointed out, a lot of times we know these things happen, but to actually have the proof is invaluable. That's what WikiLeaks gives. So this was a huge issue at the UN. And Susan Rice, who was the UN ambassador for the United States at the time, held a big press conference in the auditorium at the UN, which is rare. I was telling her spokesperson that this leveled the playing ground between the press and governments. And of course, they had to get over that. And they did. That's the problem here. These revelations are powerful and they cause a stir and it's talked about. But the news cycle changes so quickly these days. For example, BuzzFeed had a ridiculous story a couple of months back that Trump had told his lawyer Cohen to perjure himself in Congress. And Mueller's team actually came out and denied it, a rare statement from them saying it was not accurate. Well, they never retracted that story, just as The Guardian has not retracted the Paul Manafort story going in allegedly to see Assange at the embassy, because they know within 3-4 days everyone's talking about something else and it's forgotten. And although a lot of people are trying to keep the Guardian's feet to the fire on that one, but this environment of changing stories so quickly allows someone to make a huge mistake or put a full story out there and it'll be remembered and not retracted. And I think that's why the existence of the documents that are online that could be easily searched by any researcher, a journalist, or a citizen, it remains so valuable, as we saw with this Venezuelan story, this 2010 document that WikiLeaks published. Maybe no one would ever think we'd see that again or to be relevant. And it's highly relevant in the events last week with this power outage in Venezuela. This is the value of WikiLeaks right there. So the diplomatic cables in particular shed a lot of light on Middle East in particular, and the uprisings very much were a result of the releases by WikiLeaks. It's just the power of information to transform societies, and the power of the press, a government-controlled press, I have to say, in the West, certainly big business owned, that tries to bury these stories and protect the interests of the powerful. And therefore, we have the media turning against Assange and WikiLeaks in the most extraordinary way.
Absolutely. And I think that what you say, what you mentioned about the fact that all of these documents that maybe we never would have expected to have any sort of, news relevance, so many of them come up years and years later. And that's one of the many unique aspects of WikiLeaks that sets it apart from other news organizations. The breadth of the topics that the documents potentially refer to and cover is almost endless.
Yeah, I think that the campaign that needs to intensify am I on?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the campaign that needs to intensify to secure Julian Assange's right to leave the Ecuadorian embassy unharmed, unhindered, and return to either Australia or another location where he feels safe. that is what has to be stepped up. There is, while this what are the dangers? This grand jury appears to be preparing an open indictment. At the moment, the only potential charge upon which Julian Assange could be detained is over the bail-related matter to Swedish allegations which were discredited and dropped in 2017. If the bail-related matter is put aside as a result of what we're advocating, immense, the necessary diplomatic and legal pressure from the Australian government, which has a legal obligation to its citizen, which Julian Assange is, then Assange can be extricated from the embassy. He can get the necessary medical treatment he needs, and he can, certainly in Australia, be protected by a political movement as well as through all legal means. Any extradition to the United States raises the prospect of, you would expect a very, very protracted trial in which Assange would be kept incommunicado, under lock and key, and so on. So certainly in the wake of the demonstrations we held on March 3 and on March 10th, we will be now intensifying the political work we do in Australia, and of course giving all support to the necessary political work which is developing in the United States in response to the re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. My next question was going to be if you'd like to discuss the two rallies that were held, in Sydney and Melbourne by the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. And summarize, the events, what happened for the viewers who, somehow managed to miss it.
I think the main thing that these rallies were conducted, organised under conditions of blanket media censorship. There was no reportage of them given by any section of the establishment media in Australia. And most strikingly, there was no coverage or support for these rallies given by a whole range of organisations which falsely posture to be progressive or even left-wing or even socialist. It underscored, I think the campaign for these rallies served to underscore once again that any genuine movement for social and political change is going to come about through a rebellion against these old bankrupt organisations, the unions, the Labor Party, the Greens, and so on. They will do nothing to and I think, so the rallies were obviously significant in their both, they weren't the largest rallies, but they were significantly attended. Joe spoke obviously in Sydney on March 3, along with John Pilger and Professor Stuart Rees, myself, a representative of our youth movement, Oscar Grenfell, who's also a WSWS correspondent. The rally in Melbourne was likewise was well attended, and it was a very politically strong event in terms of laying out a perspective and a way forward. I was certainly struck by the warmth that was given when we made clear that the SEP will defy the silence which prevails around Julian Assange and make this an election issue. They are not going to conduct an election in Australia, most likely on May 18th, without Julian Assange being raised. And political parties and candidates will be made to answer what their position is, so that, and it forms, the fight around these fundamental issues of democratic rights.
Well, I think it's absolutely unique that you all have been fighting this fight, that you've taken up this cause as your own is really impressive. And I think, what I was impressed by myself when I was watching the vigils from afar, the demonstrations, was the number of young people that you had really passionate about this subject. How were you all able to mobilize that level of support despite the media blackout that you mentioned?
Well, that was conducted through, our youth movement, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. They conducted continuous campaigning, meetings, discussions at the university campuses, and so on, particularly at where we have established clubs such as University of Melbourne, Victoria University, Western Sydney University, Macquarie University, University of New South Wales in Sydney. We did a great deal of work around the University of Sydney as well. Yes, and I think as we uncovered in the course of the weeks of campaigning, I mean, you know, as we noted, I mean, we were meeting people who were 18 years old, 19 years old. They were 10 years old or so on when the initial exposés were published by WikiLeaks. In some cases, we were meeting people who, due to the pervasive media censorship of Assange, they, you know, didn't know he existed. They do now. They have been educated as to the significance of what was done, and they have been educated, more importantly, that what WikiLeaks is part of is a broader issue. You know, that the wholesale censorship of critical, left-wing, independent, anti-war media, and it, you know, there is a burgeoning sentiment among young people in favour of socialism, against capitalism, especially in the United States, Britain, Australia, you know, the countries which have been most at the forefront of the war on terror and the illegal wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you know, the countries most, you know, where the greatest efforts have been undertaken to stoke anti-Muslim chauvinism and so on. Of course, we're meeting this morning, and I do just want to extend the condolences of the Socialist Equality Party to all those, the families of all those who lost their lives in a fascist attack yesterday in New Zealand, and our deepest condolences and sympathy, and you know, for those struggling whose lives are still in danger. There are some 48 people, I believe, in hospital, many of whom are in critical condition. You know, this is the outcome of what WikiLeaks, what Chelsea Manning risked everything to expose. You know, illegal criminal wars, which were justified by the most, you know, the stoking of the most vicious, foul, racist, anti-Muslim sentiment. You know, the governments of the United States, Britain, and Australia, as well, you know, and the ruling elite in New Zealand, bear full responsibility for this atrocity. Particularly the government of Australia. You know, it was an Australian citizen who carried out this mass murder. You know, and this is, you know, comes in the wake of 18 years now of just continuous stoking of hysteria and xenophobia to justify Australian involvement in Afghanistan, Iraq, then Libya, then Syria, Iraq again, and so on, as well as to justify their brutal treatment of the desperate refugees who are seeking to flee the consequences of these wars. You know, people, you know, in particular from Afghanistan and so on.
Absolutely. So, no, I read a brilliant article, as always, this morning by Caitlin Johnstone discussing that exact link, that the type of Islamophobia that was encouraged after 9/11 in order to justify these, you know, imperialistic wars across the Middle East. So I think that link is an important one. It's a devastating terrorist attack, and, you know, I also extend condolences to everyone affected, for sure.
We while I'm on the air here with you, I just published an article written by Susie Dawson, of course, one of the founders of Unity for J, about the New Zealand massacre. And the point she's making is the surveillance, the mass surveillance we've all become aware of. Instead of spying on a guy like this, or a group he may belong to, let's say, they're spying on innocent citizens, and they seem to keep missing all these things. They've overblown the terrorist threat. There's no question about it. It's hyped up the way the Soviet threat was hyped up during the Cold War, how the Russian threat is hyped up now during the Second Cold War. And of course, the threat of terrorism allows them to get more money out of our pockets and to make sure they keep their jobs, and they increase their own power. So they need terrorism. They need these things. But every once in a while, there really is a terrorist attack, and they miss it. So maybe, you know, I don't know why, but they're not doing their job. But then they'll get more money. Instead of getting fired and getting new people in there, they keep their jobs, they get more money. So Susie wrote a piece talking about surveillance in New Zealand and how they could have possibly missed this. But I wanted to ask James a question because it's interesting. We obviously know why the Western governments want to get Assange and stop WikiLeaks, because then they can carry on in peace and quiet with their impunity the crimes and the corruption that they become used to doing. And he's disturbed that. He's made their lives a little more difficult. So we know why the corporate media is going along now. They changed in the U.S., I believe, because of the election in 2016, whereas the crimes of Bush, when they were released, the liberal media were kind of like that. But now when some of the corruption of Clinton was uncovered by WikiLeaks, well, he's persona non grata now, and they've dropped him. But I want to ask you, James, why are perhaps the three editors of the only really three publications in the alternative media, and I'm talking about Disobedient Media, the Socialist website, and Consortium News, are the ones writing most, I think, about Assange and WikiLeaks on a continuous basis, pointing out to our readers what a crisis this is, how any day he could be out of that embassy. And this is a major, major story, but we're the only ones covering. Why is it, James, that the rest of the alternative media, whether left or right, are not covering this story the way we are?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors that can be identified. I mean, firstly, what the term, there's been a great testing and sorting process, you would have to say, in the decade since the financial crisis, and in particular since the, really the first stages of the eruption of mass working class opposition to the failure of capitalism in 2011, which is now really the feature of world politics. Mass strike movements, political movements are developing in opposition to this ever-widening social inequality, the assault on democratic rights, the stoking of fascist forces, the active state sponsorship of fascist forces, which is part of the reason an atrocity such as what happened in Christchurch could occur. So there is a rising movement now. Much of what called itself progressive, much of what called itself left wing, have they are not opposed to the capitalist system. They are opposed to aspects of it, and in particular, they represent, in our view, sort of more privileged upper middle class stratum who were primarily concerned about the distribution of wealth at the top, and who used various forms of identity politics and so on to seek to get greater privilege for particular layers. Now, under conditions where the working class is on the move, they are just as hostile to that as the open big business parties. Though you are starting to see, even that within that milieu, they can't, as a result of what we're doing, and as a result of the intersection of what we're doing with broader social forces, there are going to be shifts. I mean, you quoted earlier Tulsi Gabbard, the first Democrat who has come out and actually made a statement in support, if you want to put it that way, of WikiLeaks. I believe Jacobin magazine, finally, after years in which it has written nothing, has actually written an article on the issue on the question of Manning's rearrest or re-imprisonment.
James, we need your voice to come through clearer. Can you do something about your microphone?
Is that any better?
Yes.
I will just speak. I'll just obviously just need to speak louder. I think I'm not sure what the issue is.
Or closer to the microphone.
Yeah, well, it's literally right in front of me. So okay. So in terms of publications such as The Nation, Jacobin, and so on, if that's what you're referring to, they have actually just been complicit through their silence in the persecution of Assange going back years. I mean, not just since 2016. And then you have a whole range of what we call pseudo-left groupings who, certainly after 2011, 2012, abandoned any posture of defense of Assange. In general, at the time, they used this ridiculous line that he needed to answer the questions in Sweden. That, of course, then escalated in 2016 into the, I mean, they rarely openly state it, but what they discuss behind in their own circles is, you know, they echo the State Department CIA line that Assange somehow worked with the Russian agencies to manipulate the US election. Now, of course, that's all now fallen by the wayside. It's quite open what's happening, as we were discussing. They are going after WikiLeaks to establish a precedent. And this, I think, is a very important issue. They want a precedent of the use of the Espionage Act against a media organisation. And so the implications internationally are, as Gabbard, I mean, they are chilling. I mean, a publication in Germany, which published leaks exposing US criminality, could face prosecution by the United States on the basis of a precedent established, through the prosecution of Assange and WikiLeaks.
I'd like to actually add, in response to what Joe asked you as well, just add that I think that there's a problem across not just establishment press, but also independent media when it comes to a story like the ongoing persecution of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. When you have something like Assange being gagged, which it's almost been it's coming up on a year since he was silenced. It's really difficult to continually report on that when there's maybe little new news on a day-to-day basis. It's the same problem that's going to be faced by supporters of Chelsea Manning when it maybe a month from now, if nothing significant has changed, there may be very little coverage of the issue. That doesn't mean that it's any less important or any less worthy of a fight against the imprisonment of Chelsea or the gagging of Julian Assange. But I think that is one factor in why, whether it's independent or maybe more so independent media than establishment press, but I think that's one factor for some of the silence. It doesn't really excuse it, but it's a reason.
I think the silence will be broken by the development of an independent political movement from below that forces the silence to be ended. The mobilisation of the working class is the critical issue. Certainly coming in the wake of the rallies, our preoccupation will be that question. The work that is conducted at workplaces, at university campuses, among students and so on, to bring them in to a political struggle in which the defence of democratic rights and the freedom of Julian Assange have to be central questions. They're not, you can't separate the struggle over the great social issues of jobs, of wages, of education, healthcare, against war, against climate change and so on, from the defence of democratic rights. Democratic rights are crucial to the social struggle. And that's why they are being attacked in every country, why they're being eviscerated. They want, we are living through dangerous times. There are dictatorial tendencies underway internationally in the so-called democratic states, and the persecution of WikiLeaks has been at the forefront of it. It's emblematic of it.
Democratic rights includes the right to information, to know what your governments are doing. And we saw that poll in Australia of 90% of the people supported WikiLeaks and Assange after that interview on 60 Minutes with Pamela Anderson. So how is the government and the media, they are keeping a lid on the population, James, the 90% who support Julian Assange. That lid is being kept on in various ways that you can explain better than I can, but I think economic pressure is certainly one of them. But and not giving voice to people because the airwaves are bottled up by people who have dispensed with Julian Assange for any number of reasons. How do you burst that? How do you break that lid that's being forced on the will of the people by government, big business, and their stooges in the press, really?
Well, I think that's what we're doing. That's the reason why we called public rallies, and the reason why we sought out principled collaboration with John Pilger, with Stuart Rees, with yourself, with Elizabeth, with all those who genuinely will take a stand in defence of fundamental democratic rights, all those who recognise the importance of the persecution of Assange and Manning. The silence will be broken by the independent initiative that we conduct and escalate and develop over the coming weeks and months. I made the point at the Melbourne rally. Look, we don't have any illusions. This is going to be difficult. It's already been. Julian has already been, as we all know, he's been imprisoned inside, arbitrarily detained in Ecuador for approaching now 7 years. If he is forced out of the embassy, it would mean a protracted legal fight, initially in Britain, to prevent extradition, and if he was extradited in the United States, against a attempt to prosecute him. So we face an ongoing struggle, but I think what we derive our confidence, if you want to put it in that, use that word, what we derive our confidence from is that it is the struggle to free Assange and Manning coincides with the ever greater verification in the day-to-day struggles of masses of people that is the great social force. The working class is the great social force that can bring about change, and it is on the move. Algeria is just the latest to be rocked to its core by the intervention of masses of people, and it is going to explode across the United States, across Europe. I mean, look at the.
We see the yellow vests. Yeah. We see the yellow vests in France as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's very confused. It doesn't have, a very clear political line or perspective. But yes, so that's there are enormous processes underway, and our aim, the aim of the SEP and the World Socialist website is to bring into this developing movement a political perspective. It's not enough just to protest in that sense, as what the yellow vests are doing. It does require the working class actually establishing its own control over society, its own workers' governments, the implementation of socialist policies, which Joe referred to 90% support for Assange. Well, among young people in the United States, in Britain, Australia, there's 60-70% support for socialism. People do not, we published, there were the climate change strikes by high school children yesterday. I mean, one of the points we made, 70% of all global emissions come from 100 large transnational companies.
Exactly.
Put those in the public ownership, and the necessary measures can be taken to drastically reduce carbon emissions. It's not
that support for socialism amongst the young. You'd have to attribute some of that to alternative media, and at the top of the list is what WikiLeaks has done. It's certainly not been the corporate media that's encouraging that point of view. Also, the economic realities of 30 years of neoliberalism, people finally waking up to it and really fed up with what's happened to their lives, that they used to be in the middle class, and that's long in the rear view mirror. And there was one moment in Trump's State of the Union address I thought was the most chilling and what was a very surreal event, in my opinion, is when he got up there and very, very angrily, nastily said, "America will never be a socialist country." You heard that, James, didn't you? And I thought that was, of course, directed at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and to Bernie Sanders, who call themselves socialists, and we could argue about that. This isn't the place for that. But it was also an extension, I believe, not only to a growing sentiment of some kind of socialism inside the U.S., but to get Maduro and then to target Cuba and Nicaragua, as Bolton openly said. have moved away from Iran and Russia. It could be because they realized that's not a fight that they could easily win, and that the disaster could be even greater than what happened in Iraq if they actually try to go after Iran. So let's pick on a much smaller enemy like Nicolas Maduro or the Cubans or Daniel Ortega. And in the meantime, we're going to crush socialism in the hemisphere because it's perking up inside our own borders. And Trump's not going to have that. And I have to, unfortunately, got a bipartisan applause for that line. America will never be a socialist country.
Well, it will. That's the point. I mean, what does Trump represent? What do the Democrats represent? They represent an oligarchy, a tiny corporate financial oligarchy, which has enriched itself at the expense of the American working people and the working people of the world. Wall Street rises to the extent that workers suffer.
No question.
Wall Street rises to the extent that ruthless wars, neo-colonial operations are carried out, and people are fed up with it. They are sick of it. At the moment, its most clear expression is the rebellious sentiment among teachers. We've made the point. One of the factors why you have such resistance emerging among educators, among teachers, is because they are the ones who deal with every day in the classrooms the consequences of the impoverishment of millions upon millions of people. They're the ones dealing with children who haven't eaten properly, who can't clothe themselves properly. So as well as dealing with their own lack of wages, graduating from college with staggering levels of debt, and then going to a job that barely allows them to meet their housing costs, let alone pay back their debts. So there are vast processes underway, and the SEP in the United States, which will be at the forefront, is at the forefront of the efforts to develop independent political struggle by American workers. And as I keep coming back to, that the banner of Assange, the banner of Manning, the banner of democratic rights will be written into those struggles. You cannot, you won't have socialism without democracy, and you're not going to have democracy, frankly, without socialism. I mean, what Joe was referring to with this hysterical speech Trump gave, I mean, what does that layer look in the future? What do they look for? They want fascism in America. They want dictatorship. They want the suppression of the people. Because in the wealth and income interests of the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and so on.
And the protection of the plutocratic status quo, no question. And I think, it has been mind-blowing for myself, coming from the Australian education system as a high school student, and then coming to see the level of debt and the level, as you say, of impoverishment when it comes to the public education system in the US, and the way in which, even just in the space of one generation, you went from, families that were able to send their children to college now not being able to do that without hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I think that aspect of things specifically, and obviously medical care, et cetera, is unique to the US. And I think that's definitely a contributing factor in the reason that so many young people and people across the country have turned towards, supporting socialist policies, where before, maybe in the last 10 or 20 years, that would have been a word that had a lot of stigma around it. So.
No, one of our speakers in Melbourne was the representative of a committee we formed, the Committee for Public Education, and she spoke very, very strongly about the relationship. I mean, education rights in Australia have been torn to shreds. Privatisation. I mean, you call them you've got the charter school process in the US. In Australia, we have just the open promotion of private schools. And she made the important point. I mean, the relationship of education and critical media, of WikiLeaks, is that, where one of the great efforts of an educator is to provide those they're educating with the truth, with a truthful account of what's going on in the world. And you don't get it from the corporate media. And so, the relationship between the struggle for the freedom of Assange, of WikiLeaks, the defence of WikiLeaks, the freedom of Manning, the defence of the expansion. I mean, what I suppose, coming back to the issue Joe raised about independent media, I mean, what do we have to fight for? It's where, you know, instead of just it being in the thousands or tens of thousands, that millions of people begin to derive their day-to-day orientation from the World Socialist website, Consortium News, Disobedient Media, and so on, instead of Fox News, you know, CNN, what's that thing that Maddow's on? MSNBC?
Yes, MSNBC.
Yes.
MSDNC.
Yes. Well, and I have to add the new Matilda to the trio of outlets that do cover Assange regularly. There's a brilliant series by Dr. Lisa Johnson on the psychology of getting Assange, which if people viewing this and listening to this haven't read it, they should absolutely go look it up. So,
and we are going to have her on as a guest, I should add, once that fourth part is out. That's what she told me down in Sydney anyway.
So part 4 is
fantastic.
It is out.
Today. It published today.
Yes,
all right. Well, we're going to have her next week, hopefully, to talk about that 4-part series.
Absolutely. Now, I think we also have Mary Costa-Cardis, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing.
Yeah.
Thank
Mary's
you. She's
here
with us now. So I'll just add her to the discussion. Welcome, Mary. Hi.
Hello there. Mary, can you unmute your microphone by going on the bottom?
Yeah. Bottom left should have a microphone, or at least it should be telling you to join audio.
Yep. No, found it. Got you. Hi.
Terrific.
Hi.
Hello there.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us, Mary. It's really a great pleasure to have you. A lot of people outside Australia may not know much about your extraordinary background. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you have the courage where so many other people in establishment media don't, to stick up for WikiLeaks?
Well, my admiration of WikiLeaks goes back to the early days in the pre-Iraq logs and pre-Iraq video days when there were a number of revelations, and I thought, as someone who worked in news, this is just extraordinary. Here's this ingenious and courageous website that's provided a way for whistleblowers to upload anonymously. And there are many whistleblowers, and they don't get the support from the public that they should be getting. Whistleblowers enhance our democracy. They're working for us. And yet, when the crunch comes, they're unsupported, and the minimum price they pay is they lose their job and they become unemployable. And the consequences can be far greater for them personally. So it seemed to me this was absolutely brilliant and a great tool for anyone working in journalism, because here you were going to have access to factual information, to the truth. And that's the biggest struggle in journalism. And that's the biggest service of journalism, to enable citizens to make their own decisions based on truth.
What were your colleagues saying back then in the early days? Your colleagues in television news and print media, you must have known some of those as well, about WikiLeaks. And what are they saying now?
Yes. In the early days, there was admiration mixed with a little bit of envy, I think. Who do they think they are? Then they got too big for their boots because they became heroes to too many people. And I think in the end, the media largely has abandoned WikiLeaks. And that's something that I think is unforgivable, because attacks on WikiLeaks are really attacks on the media in general. And unfortunately, those attacks can be successful because the people that are pursuing WikiLeaks, the institutions that are pursuing WikiLeaks, can convince the rest of us that it's really just about them when it isn't, and it shouldn't be, and we should be standing together.
Do you think there are any political reasons for why they've abandoned Assange, the establishment media?
I think it's just easier to deal with, even if there aren't political reasons, and I'm sure in some circumstances there are political reasons, and in other circumstances I think it's just a failure of imagination and a failure to engage imagination and a failure of responsibility. Sometimes when things are difficult to deal with, it's easier to not think about them. And that goes for journalists as well as the rest of us.
I've been in establishment media many, many years like yourself, and I've seen a change in the attitude of individual journalists in their relationship with the public and their relationship with government in particular. There was a sense, I think, years ago, and I'm not just saying, in the good old days, that there was never a golden age, but there was more of a sense that journalism was a public service, and that we were there to be intermediaries between government and the public to try to get what we can from the government, as much of what they were doing, what they were really doing, not just what they were telling reporters and just repeating that, but to really try to find out what's going on. And this change, I see there's a certain vanity involved in the careerism of a lot of journalists who want to be close to power rather than critique power, that they don't understand the power of the media is far different than the power of government. I think it's of a completely different kind, and I always was attracted to that power. I think it's more powerful if you can cut down the powerful people to size if they've done something wrong. That quality of thinking seems to be gone now. Am I wrong about that, or not as strong as it used to be?
I think you're absolutely right about it. And the difficulty, I think, for public broadcasting is that there was a change a couple of decades ago when we lost the importance. We forgot about the importance of collective action and the ideals that we embarked on, that led us to embark on our career. But what happened was, with this social change in employment conditions, and people were put on very short-term contracts. So, and when you have a mortgage and you're on a short-term on a 3-month or 6-month contract, you have to be you're compelled to be very careful, very cautious. And I think that's the way media organisations control journalists, and you find a lot of people that were there for many years and with a lot of experience either took redundancies or went into other areas or became freelance. And so unfortunately, the core of people left tend to be easily intimidated and that cold.
Yeah, that's at the lower levels. And in the upper levels of our business, I recall a talk that the then head of the Columbia Journalism School in New York, he pointed out one moment where particularly television news changed. Barbara Walters, I'm sure you know she was a pioneering female broadcaster, as you were in Australia, but in the US, she was given $1 million contract, the first $1 million contract sometime in the late 70s or at some point. And he said that changed the landscape. Now, TV journalists in the old days came out of the wire services and newspapers. Guys like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather here, they all started at UPI or AP. They're newsmen and newswomen. And now they're TV stars. They are personalities. They play journalists on TV. And they're paid huge bucks to entertain, like the movie network predicted that the entertainment division would take over the news division at TV stations, because it was always believed that the entertainment division would make a lot of money, so much money that they could support a losing news department, that the news division was not going to make money, but it had to be supported by entertainment because it was a public service. That's gone. It has to make money too. And then you've got these huge stars making incredible amounts of money to fool us on TV that they're really giving us journalism. It's a pretty sorry state right now.
Yeah, well, the news departments became part of the entertainment division, and then decisions about what is newsworthy are obviously affected by that, and decisions about who you have in the role of anchor and senior correspondents is affected by that. So the emphasis is much more on entertainment, really, than the sorts of values that should underlie proper journalism.
And governments sleep well at night with that situation. But stepping into the breach is WikiLeaks, coming out of nowhere, doing it even better than serious journalists could do by getting the actual raw materials, the documents, and as you pointed out, ingeniously sent by whistleblowers in an anonymous way. And that's a big problem. And that's why we're having these vigils, because they want to get Assange and they want to stop WikiLeaks. What could the public do, in your opinion, Mary, if the media fails to try to support WikiLeaks continuing to do its work?
Well, we need a bigger collective voice, and I'm particularly disappointed in the situation back here. Australia is where he comes from, and we need to improve or work on our networks, because when the crunch comes, and we should be forcing that moment, we should be putting pressure on our government to negotiate for his safe passage home. And but then the problem when he gets here is, and I think that there's a mistaken belief among supporters here that once in Australia he's going to be safe, and I don't think that's the case because we have an extradition treaty with the United States, and I've been told by one of the major party's elder statesmen that a government, an Australian government of any persuasion, would be obliged to extradite him to the United States under the terms of our treaty. And when I put to this person, well, there'll be protests, the response was, so be it. So you can see how determined they would be and the sort of effort it would take here. I really am concerned about that. As I said, it's one step to get him out of there and perhaps back here. Frankly, I think, he'd be better off going to a country that's not likely to do that.
Under the previous government of Ecuador, it would have been ideal to have safe passage to Ecuador, but under the current conditions, that doesn't look like it would be much of a safe haven either. So it's a terrible situation. But
yes,
Joe, go ahead.
I really think that governments though do listen to large numbers of people, and it's really about the size of the response. It's one thing to say, we won't worry about protests, but you have to send a very, very strong signal. And I think governments are concerned about not being losing the confidence of voters on serious issues, perhaps particularly if that issue can be translated so that it captures the imagination of large numbers of people. Unfortunately, many of us don't really understand how our democracy is undermined daily, and the efforts that some people put into trying to ensure or trying to shore up our democracy. And we don't, unfortunately, we perhaps don't understand until we lose those rights, and they're being undermined on a daily basis. So yes, I think the answer is definitely to try and shore up as much support back home as possible.
Do you think you're describing the kind of, seam of envy amongst, your colleagues at the time that WikiLeaks became prominent and started to publish? Do you think that the current, lack of support and, vitriol that's aimed at WikiLeaks from much of the establishment media is really the manifestation of that envy that's been given an excuse to unleash itself because of the events of 2016?
Yes, I think there are various factors. The envy is one of them. Another is just it's easier not to have to deal with it and write them off as rat bags. And it's just that the unfortunate effect of that is that the real issues aren't, given enough airtime. The issues that are given airtime are ones of personality, so that they'll focus on Julian's personality or who they think he is, what the conclusions they come to about his personality, and it's much easier for them to deal with that than to deal with all of the material that is being released and all the potential investigative stories that could be done. Much easier to focus on him as a personality. The trouble with that is that then, people may start making decisions about whose human rights are worth defending. So if you come to a conclusion about a person's personality and you think that they're a bit too big for their boots, or they're a narcissist, or whatever conclusion you come to, all of a sudden, the leap from that is that, if we don't like someone, we don't defend their human rights. So for me, it operates on so many levels. Firstly, it's the human rights of an individual, but secondly, it's what that individual represents, the organisation, and in fact, the organisation is more than the one person. When I was in London some years ago, I had the privilege of meeting some of the people behind WikiLeaks, and they are an extraordinary, highly intelligent, resourceful, dedicated, courageous group of people. And I think that all of that is discounted because of the focus on the perceived personality of the founder.
Yeah, and as you and Joe were discussing, it's as if, in this shift from, somewhat morally guided journalism to almost reality television entertainment, issues that should be covered with a sense of depth are just reduced into tiny sound bites. And I think that's something that you're describing as affecting the coverage of Assange, which, boils him down to a personality kind of cartoon as opposed to a discussion of the issues that matter around the case, for sure.
Yes, unfortunately, that's definitely the case. And I'm very pleased that I was involved in the media when I was and got out when I did, because I don't think I would have, it's not something that I could do at the moment. Yeah.
That's a huge shame. I'm so sorry. It's one of those indictments against the entire industry, I guess, that people like yourself have been so directly kind of driven out, or, that it's become an environment where it's impossible to work with a sense of integrity.
But there are other ways that you can contribute, and I think that that's very important. Fortunately, in today's digital world, it's important to build. It's possible to build networks. And in fact, I think people are congregating less around the traditional portals, and our habits are changing. We get news now from Twitter. It's the fastest way to let people know something that's happening live. So yeah, I think that it's not as bad as it sounds. Unfortunately, though, for those people that do congregate around the telly still and watch the programs, I think it's a little bit dismal. What can I say?
Yeah, no, it is a depressing scene. Joe, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to ask Mary if she has any views on what's going on with Chelsea Manning.
Oh, what a courageous human being. What a principled human being. She's just extraordinary. The fact that she's prepared to do this, she's already paid an enormous price. But it's such an important moment because it galvanizes people. It makes you remember the importance of standing by your principles. And what she's doing really is highlighting the importance of WikiLeaks, saying, I'm sorry, this organization is too important. You can't do this to the rest of us. Yeah.
What an example of courage. And that's what we need, and we have such short supply, to stand up to people in authority who are not behaving in the interest of the public. And Chelsea Manning is not going to be driven through this secret grand jury process to try to nail Assange, because they don't want to get him on parts of that Espionage Act where he's not allowed to be in possession or disseminate, Assange I'm talking about, classified information. That would be challenged probably on First Amendment grounds and could lose. So they're trying to show how Assange participated in the theft of the classified emails, documents rather. And Chelsea says that in her court-martial, she answered that question many, many times, that it was all her own doing. And to not want to go through that process again and rather go to jail than to be railroaded into something in the grand jury, which of course you have no defense attorney there, as she did during the court-martial. So there's no counsel to advise her how to answer a question or whether to answer a question. She's compelled to answer these questions with no defense, no cross-examination, just to have to be browbeaten by prosecutors, and they can be a mean lot, if they need to be. So it's what kind of coverage is that getting in Australia? I just came from Australia 2 days ago, but I didn't see too much there, and it's not getting a hell of a lot here either in the US now that I'm back here.
No, it's not getting a lot of coverage. It's not getting the coverage that it should get. You mentioned something when you were talking about Chelsea earlier. It's really about trying to demonize Julian Assange, and when, for example, the release of the DNC and emails, documents, and Hillary's emails occurred, the big issue, the big story was, they are influencing a US election by releasing these documents, when really it's exactly the opposite. If you have that information, you are influenced then, and you withhold it, that's when you're trying to influence the US election. If you have this information, you have to release it so that the public can be aware. And what they did to Bernie Sanders was extraordinary. And we wouldn't have known that if it wasn't for WikiLeaks.
And legal, unfortunately, because they tried to sue, and the court basically said it was a private organization and they can be as corrupt as they want to. They're not subject to, they're subject to their rules, not to the law, in a sense. There's a good example. Sorry, go ahead.
As we say, no, but they're accountable to the US public. And it was very, very important for the US public to be aware of what happened, and for the rest of us to be aware of what happened.
Absolutely. There is an example of where you mentioned where by withholding the information, you'd have an impact on the election. And that was the New York Times reporter James Risen, who had learned before the 2006 election, Kerry Bush, that the U.S. was violating the Fourth Amendment by warrantless wiretapping of American citizens on U.S. territory. Totally against the law, against what the NSA used to teach their employees not to do. Because what happened after 9/11, of course, was the president's program. So Risen had this story, and his Times editors sat on it. They did not publish before the election, fearing that it would have an impact on the election. Well, the voters need to know this. They're the ones who will make the decision about whether it impacts the election, not the newspaper. You just put it out there, and you cannot withhold it. And they did, and they would have continued to withhold, except Risen was coming out with his own book, and he was going to scoop his own newspaper. So they realized at that point they would look pretty silly if their reporter wrote it in a book and they didn't publish it. So they published it too late after the election. I had a similar instance. I was working for the Boston Globe as their UN correspondent in that same election, the Kerry Bush election. And I did I was working on a piece about Kerry's stance on the International Criminal Court, whether he believed in it or not. And I discovered that he really wasn't a great supporter of the International Criminal Court. And the Globe was his hometown newspaper. He's from Massachusetts. And my editors weren't all that keen on it, but we did not withhold that story. Not that it had an impact on the election. It's not something like warrantless wiretaps. But the fact was the decision was made to publish that article because if you get the news, when you get it, you publish it, regardless of the electoral cycle, And people often say, too, that why didn't WikiLeaks put out these emails about Bernie Sanders during the primaries? Because why did they withhold them? Because if we knew what the DNC and Hillary was doing to Bernie during the primaries, if WikiLeaks had released that then, maybe he would have won the nomination. Well, my answer has to be that they didn't have him. Exactly. And when they get them, they have to vet them. They have to look at each email. This is a different process than in traditional media because they're looking at documents with metadata and stuff like that we never dealt with. I never dealt with that. So they had to verify that these were not one of them was a fraudulent or made up or counterfeit email to keep their record of 100% accuracy. So when they had them ready, they released them. And that happened to be too late to help Bernie, but it was just before the DNC. You also want to maximize impact. I mean, this is what journalists do. You want the news to be have an impact, and that's still a sore spot. I have to say, Dan Ellsberg, who I met with yesterday out in Berkeley on my way back from Sydney, said he's very upset about the timing. And then we had the same conversation I've just had with you about Risen, and of course he agrees with me about Risen, but he thinks that Assange wanted to hurt Hillary Clinton, and a lot of people feel that way.
I just couldn't possibly understand a journalist deciding to hold on to publishing that material because it's really up to the public to decide, the impact that it's going to have on their decision. But as you point out, this sort of thing happens a lot in media organisations. Journalists are under pressure to put off a story for whatever reason, generally in media organisations, they're not in control. Ultimately, they're not the editor, so it's successful. In your organisation, in WikiLeaks, and in too few others, that's not the case. So we were talking a little bit before about envy. Well, imagine if you worked in a big media organisation and here was WikiLeaks doing what they, are able to do, and you have to be very, very cautious. And so it's complicated. The mainstream media's relationship to WikiLeaks is complicated. It operates there are multiple factors at work here. It's very disappointing. what can I say? But we have to find a way to generate a bigger public voice and a bigger collective voice.
Do you have any advice for our listeners and viewers on how they can sort of empower themselves in order to raise their collective voices? Do you have any thoughts on what the average person listening can do?
Yeah, I think in our networks, it's really vital to inform people of the benefits of what we've gained from WikiLeaks, but also just to talk about, to raise awareness of what are the public interest issues in democracy and maintaining the health of our democracy. I think that there's probably, it's just a function of society today that we're more interested in our hip pocket and, whether the upcoming election is going to mean that there are going to be tax breaks or no tax breaks, and who's getting the tax breaks. That seems to be the emphasis and the focal point of interest. Fortunately, there's also interest growing in climate change and more important issues like that. But the importance of freedom of information, the importance of our access to that information is being threatened and undermined all the time in ways that we aren't necessarily aware of. And WikiLeaks is a warrior. It's a real David and Goliath metaphor, and I think we need to have institutions and people that we're proud of, and we have to be able to see that WikiLeaks is something that's homegrown, that's Australian in origin, and we can be proud of it and we can defend it. And I say that on a day when Australians are just astonished because an Australian has been responsible for gunning down 40 people in a mosque in New Zealand. There are enough reasons to be concerned about our society. So, and we have to be able to express that concern and to say, this is not us. This is something we are deeply mortified at, ashamed at. And equally, we have to have the courage to say, but we are very proud of this, because this little organisation is providing a service to democracy, not just for us, but for people around the world. Because if you look at the stories that have emanated from the information that WikiLeaks has provided, it just goes on, including Venezuela and the whole issue around the power grid in Venezuela and the interest that the US has had in that for a very long time. So we have to be able to see this as something that we are very proud of and are prepared to defend, and to say to our politicians, you really need to stand up for this person and for this organisation.
They seem to lack the courage to do that. They'd much rather just follow American dictates for whatever reasons. And this is a huge problem in Australia, isn't it?
Well,
lack of sovereignty.
It is. We've allied ourselves with the US on so many big issues. We've gone into war with them, and these are wars that are prosecuted in our name. And WikiLeaks is really, in the end, the only way that we've been able to find out some critical information about that war and the reasons for that war. I think little New Zealand has been more courageous, and we have to watch that closely, because it's leaders like Arden who can capture the public imagination, because what she's saying is that being ethical, both as a human being and as an institution, we want our democracy, our parliament, to be ethical, to fulfill our responsibility to the citizens of this country. And it's important for us to see that that model is possible. I'm not saying that, you know, she's necessarily perfect and that the New Zealand government is perfect, but we need to be able to promote people into our parliament who have got the right values. Because, as you say, unfortunately, it's really about people who can sell, you know, very short messages that have very little substance, and often will encourage xenophobia and hatred towards minority groups. And what we need is someone who can capture the public imagination and say, look, we're really, the most important thing is our humanity and how we behave towards each other and how countries behave towards each other. Because one of the tools that's used constantly is this issue of the national interest and what's in the national interest. Well, it's not in the national interest if we disempower people in another part of the world, and if we generate hatred by ensuring that they're robbed of their natural resources, or, you know, many of them are killed in wars that are really ultimately about resources. That's not in our public interest, and it's not in the interest of global peace, because you can't have peace without justice. That's been a major theme of a foundation at which I chaired for a little while, and which awarded Julian Assange a gold medal for peace some years ago, before he went into the Ecuadorian embassy. That's what they're the things that should be uniting us, and unfortunately we're waylaid by people who are selling very, very different messages. But I'm encouraged in Australia by some change in the political arena. We've got some interesting candidates coming up in this federal election, including Julian Burnside, who has acted for Julian Assange, and he's standing for the Greens. And of course, there are all sorts of smear campaigns against him. But I think he's going to, well, I'm hoping he will win against the current treasurer, the seat of Kooyong. But even if he doesn't, in the meantime, he's generating a lot of public discourse around what is fundamentally important in politics, what is fundamentally important in society. And we need more of that. And I think other candidates, such as the young woman who is running against our former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in his seat, this is starting to happen here in a bigger way than it has in the past. So there is cause for some hope. There are some encouraging signs, and really those signs are about positive forces in society that are engaging the public imagination and saying, I'm normal, I'm human, and I want to represent you in Parliament. This is what I stand for, and these are the values, and values that we can be proud of, I think.
And no courageous judge in an extradition court in Australia could say these charges against Assange, they don't amount to very much. He's a publisher. You can't have him arrested on that. You don't think there's one judge in Australia who could deny extradition to the U.S.?
I think there's some important work to be done here, because there are lawyers who are experts in these international treaties, and we certainly need to be working with them to prepare for that eventuality. That's a very important aspect of what needs to be happening right now. Because I think in the end, judges have to interpret the law, and if the law is fairly black and white, I think that the outcome is going to be predictable. So we need advice on that. And
I agree. We're just being joined now as well by George Smuley. Sorry to interrupt. It's always difficult finding a pause in conversation when it's appropriate to bring a new guest in. But I think it's interesting that, as we were talking about Venezuela earlier, in the way that WikiLeaks documents were, have obviously been relevant on so many different issues, but are also relevant on the current, aggression of the US towards Venezuela. It's so shocking to me, the degree with which there is a very little attempt to really convincingly portray this as a regime change effort based on the interest of humanitarian rights, as I think we saw in previous regime change efforts. It really seems to almost, the mask is somewhat slipping to a degree that I haven't seen previous. I didn't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it just is striking.
Sorry, you talking to me or to the new?
Yeah, no, to you.
All right. Well, we'll have to see how this is played out, really. Often when there's hard evidence, there are no consequences. At the moment, we have documents that point to the possibility that this is what happened. We would need, one would need to be able to prove that that is, in fact, what happened. And even then, governments get away with this sort of thing. So we have to just wait and see. I mean, this is why Correa had so much admiration, the admiration of so many people, because he was incredibly courageous, and he made a decision that he would be able to help his country get out of the hole it was in without the help of the United States. And he was succeeding, but that's not the case today. What can I say? Well, the current leader is continuing to try and do that, but he's using the more traditional means.
Right. No, absolutely. I agree. George, do you have any thoughts to add on the issue of Venezuela, or any of the other sort of discussions we've had so far today? We've been obviously talking about Chelsea Manning, as well as Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and the developments in both of these cases.
Well, I mean, when you think of Venezuela, I mean, the unending, unremitting stream of lies that emanating from the Western media, it is quite stunning. Elliot Abrams comes on, and he's allowed to pontificate without any real pushback and without any real challenge, and as if somehow his views actually have any real merit to them. And so, who gets the challenge? You get somebody like Max Blumenthal. He would challenge it, but exactly, people who are actually doing some serious journalism, but they unfortunately are kind of relegated to the internet, where we watch them and we think that was a brilliant performance and brave performance by Max Blumenthal, but it doesn't reach the kind of wider audience that needs to know something about Elliot Abrams. I mean, we just know. I mean, this is a guy who was involved in regime change wars during the 1980s. I mean, those horrific wars that went on for the entire decade in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. He was intimately involved in that, and now he's been brought back. Why was he brought back? Well, he was brought back precisely because Pompeo and the Bolton wanted the replication of those very wars from the 80s to today. I mean, so that's the striking thing, that you get this kind of monolithic media culture in which there is really almost no real challenge to the idea that, we're of course trying to bring democracy to Venezuela. This is the guy, Elliot Abrams. Did he bring democracy to Central America? I mean, what he was doing. And I just find this really just stunning. And this is why, of course, WikiLeaks is so important, because WikiLeaks provides an ample documentation of those very years. I mean, of the 1980s and those terrible wars that the United States was waging for no reason whatsoever, other than that Nicaragua had the temerity to install a socialist government. Nicaragua, is a tiny country, because there's no threat whatsoever to the United States, no threat whatsoever to Mexico or any country at all. The United States decided to wage this horrific war against it. And then when Nicaragua, obviously trying to defend itself, naturally, as do all countries in war, they imposed all sorts of restrictions on freedom of expression and so on, which is why war is not a good idea, because war tends to be incompatible with freedom and democracy. So when Nicaragua does impose these restrictions, that becomes further proof that the Sandinistas are a totalitarian bunch. They want to introduce Soviet-style socialism in Nicaragua. This was the war that was waged by Elliot Abrams, and now he's back. I mean, it's just a shocking development.
Yeah, no, none of that context is given when there's a discussion of Elliot Abrams and his contributions to the horrible suffering during that time period. None of that is brought up by establishment media.
Yeah, that's right. And really, I mean, anybody who was around in the 80s will have at least remember what a controversial figure he was. I mean, it wasn't just, he was, convicted. Eventually, he was convicted of lying to Congress. And it was just a series of lies that he was engaged in. I mean, for instance, the use of humanitarian aid in order to ship in weaponry. I mean, this was fundamental violations of international law. Abrams was involved in that. I mean, the New York Times reported this. This isn't some fringe website that reported this. Was in the New York Times. And Abrams said, hey, well, what the hell does it matter? And then they're surprised why, Maduro says, no, we're not bringing in any of your humanitarian aid. And then they're surprised why the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross also said, we are not taking part in this distribution of humanitarian aid. We basically don't trust you to be engaged in humanitarian work. There's a political agenda that we have no interest in assisting. So, this is the person, and he just gets a completely, unchallenged, passage through the media, whether it's MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, wherever. He just waltzes in and, Mr. Abrams, what's happening in Venezuela? Well, things are very grim. It's Maduro is doing these terrible things. And you say, well, hey, how about doing a little bit of journalistic work? How about challenging, Abrams as being some sort of a reliable source on all of this?
Yeah, Mary, did you have any thoughts to add on that or to respond to that?
No, but I mean, he's absolutely right. Of course, this is what happens in the mainstream media, and it's the result of a lot of people who know what actually happened and remember, but have a vested interest in not going there, and those that don't. Because there isn't that same emphasis in newsrooms and as in the past, where you had to research a story, you had to, we take press releases, government press releases, and basically announce them. That's what happens. So you don't have what is presented as fact challenged, even when the person is on the record and has had this public life where he's done all this stuff, which is discoverable on the internet. So it's disappointing and it's laughable, except that the consequences are quite serious for society and for our ignorance.
And so this is what has happened, that we have journalists who now see themselves as part of an elite. You know, just watch the TV shows, you know, when Abrams comes on and talks to the reporters talk to him as if he's their friend. He's not, their job isn't really to challenge him, but he's just their friend, to exchange ideas and views on the world, you know, before heading off for a cocktail party. And so this is what journalists have become. They see themselves as part of the political establishment. You know, it's like, you know, the way this whole first name things, you know, Nick this, Elliot that, Tom this. I mean, so, you know, they're all on first name terms, as if, you know, we're all good friends together. Just, you know, watch a press conference, you know, a State Department press conference, and, you know, it's all on first name terms. It's all joking around, you know, as if they're pals together. You think, well, don't you have a job? Don't you, you know, to inform your readers about what is going on? You know, no, that's not really how they see their jobs. It's more, you know, how to feather their nest, how to advance their careers within the party structure. And of course, you know, that's why, you know, there's almost this revolving door between journalism and government. I mean, you do a stint in the media, then you go into government, then you come back into the media, then you go back into the government. So often these days, you know, you're looking at people on the media, and you think, well, is he here as in his capacity as a ABC News correspondent, or is he here as you know, a press spokesman in waiting for the incoming Democrat administration, or, you know, vice versa? It could be a Republican. Are you a Fox News pundit, or are you in training for a job in the next Republican administration? It's very hard to know the difference between them. And this is now, you know, and this isn't just pundits. This is, you know, this goes for you know, straight down the line reporters who work as reporters, and then they go off and, you know, work as speechwriters or PR consultants for politicians. So, you know, reporters are no longer the sort of what they used to be, kind of, you know, who in some ways saw themselves as they had to find out what government was doing. No, it's more about, you know, how to feather their own nest, how to advance their careers within the system.
Elizabeth, can I just say?
Yeah, go right ahead.
That's very interesting, and it's, I have to say though, fortunately it's not quite as bad in Australia as it is in the United States, although we do have journalists, you know, becoming speech writers and vice versa, moving in and out of those two areas. But in the US, you can, you know, all you have to do is look at these big media organizations with many millions of followers and see precisely this being played out, and it's been described very, very well. And the problem is that for the rest of the world, the US seems to be something to emulate, and if they're getting away with it, then, you know, this is what is replicated elsewhere. People with the same interests are going to be doing exactly the same thing and getting away with it. You know, it's like saying, well, we can do that too, not just them. And that's, unfortunately, then you have a bigger and bigger gap between the truth and the fundamental issues that are important or should be important to us. And all of that is suppressed for this charade, really. And we don't want it to happen elsewhere. We don't want it to pervade our media the way it has in the United States. But there are other ways in which other destructive forces in the media too, and one's apathy. You know, it beggars belief that someone would become a journalist who isn't passionate about the truth and just about, you know, curious and dogged. But that's not the case necessarily at all today. You have people with multiple university degrees applying for cadetships, and they look really, really good on paper because they've got all, they've done economics and they've done all sorts of things, and then you find that they lack the fundamental things that are fundamentally important to a journalist, and that curiosity and that perseverance. So we've forgotten what's really important, and we're really going for the the stars and spangles as happens in the US. But it's really wonderful listening to you, George, and I apologise, I have to go, but I just want to congratulate you and Elizabeth and Joe.
Elizabeth and Joe should be the ones to be congratulated. They're the ones who are doing it. They're running it.
Yeah, fabulous,
week after week.
Fabulous thing to do. Yeah, and I hope that there are many, many people watching your work, which is really, really important. And thank you for having me on. It's been an honor.
No, it's an honor. It's an honor to have you with us, and we appreciate it. And thank you so much. It really is a pleasure, especially hearing from fellow Australian on this subject. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Bye. Just changing over. Yeah. Okay. So yes. I think the issue that Mary was just raising and discussing, it reminds me, it brings me back again to the way in which WikiLeaks has been responsible for really not just being not just separating itself from the crowd of other media organizations in the way that it has kind of revolutionized journalism, but also its publications, especially what we saw in 2016. It really has exposed. It's not only separated from the pack, but it's also directly exposed the media and exactly the dynamic that Mary was describing, that you're discussing, where you have that interrelationship between the state and political parties and these journalists. We see CIA, members coming in and on these cable news outlets discussing issues as if they're a correspondent. It's incredible. So.
Yes, yeah, exactly. They come on and they give their views, and it's there's a sort of unquestioning acceptance, as if their views are to be taken seriously. So, for instance, now you obviously you've seen the stories about what happened in Madrid with the storming of the North Korean embassy. Now, it is a shocking story. I mean, to be honest, I have to admit, I didn't know the story. I missed the story completely when it happened in February. So, which is itself amazing. Yeah, because it's a shocking the idea that an embassy was stormed, and we didn't know who it was. And now the Spanish are reporting that there's a CIA connection, which makes a lot of sense. So how is this reported? So you get the Washington Post goes to some ex-CIA person and asks him, well, what do you think? Well, I don't think the CIA was involved in this. Doesn't sound to me like the CIA. Okay, fine. Right. So that's the CIA wasn't involved. I think, well, what do you think that some CIA person is going to say? The person's going to say, no CIA involvement. And this goes on all the time, as if that these people are telling the truth. The same thing happens when that guy Paul Whelan, who was arrested in Russia. Now, I don't know, the story. Who knows what the story is? But what do the journalists do? They go asking again CIA people, and well, do you think that he was an American spy? No. He was not an American spy. No, I think this is all Putin trying to use some kind of a propaganda weapon against the West, or maybe he's trying to effect a swap with Maria Butina, but definitely no. This doesn't sound at all like a spy. Oh, okay, right, fine. That's like spy. It's like this is the way that goes on. That you have this a completely uncritical spirit with a view to essentially transmit government propaganda.
I think the phrase "state stenographer" really does seem applicable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, for instance, the story about Russian interference in the 2016 election. What is the source for this? Who has given us evidence about this? It's entirely the product of CIA and FBI. We know who these people are. So Brennan, Comey, Strzok, the whole bunch of them, McCabe. These are the people who sat down and wrote up about Russian interference. And now this is just simply gospel truth. The media report this as if it's an established fact. Russia, of course, interfered in this election. They did it with a view to defeating Hillary Clinton and bringing in President Trump. What's your evidence for this? I mean, the CIA said so, and therefore it must be true. And this goes on all the time. And so, from one minute it's an allegation, next minute it's already established fact, and then every single media outlet reports something as an established fact. And then, of course, the effect of it is on most people is, well, okay, well, it's been proven. I mean, what do I know? I mean, people don't have time to start checking every single thing they read. Well, if they say, well, if it's been established that the Russians interfered, then Russians must have interfered.
Yeah, no, I mean, you see those exact phrases used, like it is now a known fact that,
yes,
et cetera,
right.
et cetera.
That's right.
And I think that part of the reason that maybe some people don't question those sorts of statements is because there is this assumption that the media is adversarial towards, maybe the state and its claims. So if the journalists are saying it, well, they must have verified it. They're supposed to double check these things. So and I think the reality that, you and Mary have been really, reinforcing, which is totally accurate, is that there is no adversarial relationship. And that's the disconnection between the reality versus what it should be and what maybe some of the public thinks that it is.
That's exactly right. And so what they call adversarial is really just a Punch and Judy show between Jim Acosta and Donald Trump. But on everything that's important, Acosta and Trump are actually on the same page. They both hate Julian Assange. They both want Julian Assange captured, imprisoned for the rest of his life. They both are on board for every kind of interventionist policy. They both hate Russia like the plague. They both basically, don't think the public should be thoroughly informed about anything. And of course, they both unquestionably accept that, Israel, say, is the victim and, being set upon by these monstrous Palestinians who want to drive them into the sea. So on anything important, they're in agreement. But we have to go through this daily kind of Punch and Judy show whereby, it's as if, they're about to start punching each other. They hate each other so much.
Of course. This
is the adversarial, kind of phony adversarial journalism.
That's a great point. And I think that, it is, I think a lot of independently minded journalists have pointed out that it's shocking the way in which there's this, resist movement amongst Democrats and liberal journalists, except for when it comes to interventionism, whether it's in Venezuela or Syria. Then we suddenly think that Trump's just wonderful and that he's learning statesmanship. Because so it's very telling, definitely.
Yes. That's exactly it. And so that's how you get this. Well, but if it's adversarial, then obviously, I mean, the other day there's this guy Zucker, who's the head of CNN. He collected some awards. I mean, all these people who hold these big jobs, they're always collecting some award or other, for press freedom. Award. And he gave some speech, about the First Amendment and so on. And you realize that, CNN, of course, has never done anything to support Julian Assange. I mean, that's, of course, an absolute given. It's never really given any support for press freedom. I mean, it's actually campaigned in order to get people off the air. I mean, it was Alex Jones. I mean, he campaigned to get Alex Jones off the air. It started harassing ordinary people because they were involved in some Russian scheme, who set up these websites or whatever. They harassed those people. There's a whole history, and of course there was the RT. They tried to get those people off RT who were doing that show In the Now, get them off Facebook and so on. So CNN's entire record is actually absolutely, not just that they haven't done anything for press freedom, they actually thwarted press freedom. That's what they do. They try to thwart press freedom, and the guy collects a First Amendment award. And let me tell you what I think of the First Amendment. I've got a lot of views on this.
No, absolutely. And I think adding to that, not only are they, against actually independent press when it comes to shows that are on RT, because there's nowhere else that will host shows that are independently minded, but you also see that type of vitriol aimed directly at Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I mean, at one point, I believe it was in 2017, Assange compiled a list of all of these individuals in the media and in the establishment who were directly called for his death, for the torture of WikiLeaks staff and their children. It is incredible the degree of vitriol that is aimed at Julian Assange by these people who are supposed to be adversarial towards the same powers that Julian Assange has exposed.
Yes. So. Yeah. No, and I remember that. Those people who were explicitly calling for his murder. There was that guy Bob Beckel, who supposedly was a Democrat. He was the sort of the left-wing voice on Fox News, and he was the one who was calling for his murder. And there were these others. Was it? I think Biden was calling for his death. Hillary Clinton was calling for his death. I mean, this went on. Throughout the sort of political establishment, and itself is just an amazing thing. I mean, you think you're calling for the death of someone who is making information publicly available. I mean, that's what he's doing. I mean, he's not done anything to anyone other than to try to create an informed public. So he's doing a public service. This is the person you want to put to death.
Yeah, well, and speaking of Biden, I believe I saw recently that it's not as if WikiLeaks has published anything that has substantially injured actual national security concerns or damaged the safety of individuals. The only times that has ever happened was when the Cablegate archives were leaked unredacted, not by WikiLeaks but by other individuals. But nonetheless, these pundits and Joe Biden, etc., act as if the heart of national security had been exposed by these people. In reality, they've just been embarrassed by their own dirty laundry being exposed, and that is exactly it exposes the way in which the media is the protector of those secrets rather than
and that's a very important point, because they pretend that somehow it's national security that's in danger. But it's not national security that's in danger. It's the fact that these terrible decisions are being made by stupid, ill-informed people whose stupid acts are leading to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. And we're getting a sense of their thought process, of just how ill-informed they were when they made these momentous decisions. And that's what they don't like, because of the sheer embarrassment of this information becoming available. So they dress it up. Well, these sources and methods are being exposed. No, they haven't shown anyone at all. There's been no evidence whatsoever that any source has been burnt as a result of I think WikiLeaks. The only source has been burnt, I think, are incompetent journalists at The Intercept who burned sources, who provided them with information. But I haven't seen any sources being burned through WikiLeaks.
Absolutely no. It's been quite the opposite. I mean, as a lot of the viewers and listeners know, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange were at the forefront of attempting to help and support Chelsea Manning throughout the process of her court-martial and imprisonment. The movement to help her was at least in large part, thanks to WikiLeaks. And so I don't think there's any parallel with any other journalistic organization that has gone to that length to support sources. And I think as well, it's incredible that, when we discuss the lack of adversarial journalism in mainstream media, what we see with Assange and him being essentially tortured in this Ecuadorian embassy, that's the actual result of adversarial journalism.
Absolutely.
And that's such an indictment against our system as it stands. So.
Exactly. That's exactly the adversary. That's the imprisonment. That's evolved is somebody who is doing something that powerful people don't like done. Yeah. Then you're hurting powerful people when they punish you in this way, and that's true of Julian, and of course that's now true of Chelsea Manning. Well, of course it's been true with her for a long time. But again, if you're doing something that the elites like, you get rewarded. Jim Acosta he's a celebrity. He's if you're a celebrity, it means you're not doing anything that's upsetting anyone. I mean, that people are happy to have you around as a kind of a jovial buffoon, and posturing as an adversarial journalist. But if you're doing something serious, if you're really threatening the interests of powerful people, you're going to be suffering. I mean, and that's the sad thing. There's a serious price to pay for truth and finding out what powerful people are up to, and that's the price that's being paid by Julian and Chelsea Manning.
Absolutely. And speaking of journalism, we also have Anne Garrison with us, and I'm just adding her to the conversation right now. Welcome, Anne. Thank you for joining us again. If you can hear us. Oh, it looks like she's not there. Okay. Well, I guess not. So, but back to what we were saying, though, I think that, I think Chris Hedges really did sum it up perfectly when he said that it was, the Ecuadorian embassy has turned into a little house of horrors, or a little shop of horrors. And I think that, you can't emphasize enough that is not, the result of any sort of wrongdoing on his part. This is the result of what adversarial journalism actually, is and looks like in the West today. So, I've seen. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's what it looks like, and that's why it's just painful for us, to watch, because we want to do something to help, but it's it is really very, very difficult, because we're up against very, very powerful forces. But yeah, I mean, I think when you think of the extraordinary courage and resilience that has been shown by Julian, I mean, it's just, you think, just being in that small embassy, this isn't some giant, like the U.S. embassy in some place, like Cardinal Mindszenty, who was I can't remember, was it 15, almost 14 years he was in the U.S. embassy in Hungary. I mean, that's a big building. I mean, you can get out, step outside, enjoy the fresh air. This is a tiny little apartment. He doesn't. It's almost just. I mean, just very disturbing, even just to imagine what that's like.
Absolutely, and I think Anne may have returned and can join us now. But yeah, I completely agree, and I think that we've discussed many times in the vigils, but it's worth revisiting the fact that in 2015, now going on 4 years ago, we knew that WikiLeaks published medical records that indicated the severity of the medical issues that he's suffering due to that imprisonment without medical care, ranging from, dental issues to the fact that, his eyesight is affected by the lack of differing, dimensions. So it's horrendous. It has to stay in the conversation, in the minds of people, because if vigils like this don't exist, or if efforts like the Socialist Equality Party rallies, over the last couple of weeks, if those don't continue to happen, the establishment press will be all too happy to have us all forget about that suffering, by Assange, and now by Chelsea Manning again. But welcome, Anne. Glad you could.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Hello, Anne.
Can you hear us? I don't know if Anne can hear us. Well, if our tech support could maybe message Anne and help her get connected with us, we'd like to speak with her. Okay. Well, I think that basically, though, I think if you wanted to add any thoughts on that to just,
well, I think,
please go ahead.
That's just it really is a matter of what I was thinking today, you've probably read about what's happening at the Intercept, and how they're closing down the access to
Snowden files and the
Snowden
NSA
files, exactly. So they're closing that down, and you've got to think that, well, if Snowden had passed it on to WikiLeaks, we would all have had access to this. So, and we would have had access to it years ago, and then we wouldn't be in this situation whereby, a rich person like this Omidyar has basically limited access to it for years and years, and now he's closed it down altogether. So, I mean, I know I've read that that Greenwald is trying to get some academic institution involved, and I don't know, whether that's going to work out. I hope it does. But I was thinking, well, had it been WikiLeaks, we would all have had access to it. We would all have been, somebody actually wrote this in a tweet. We would have had millions of unpaid researchers going through this and finding out exactly what was in these files.
Exactly.
We haven't had that opportunity.
And not only have they taken the documents down that they had published, but I mean, as you know, there were God knows how many documents that were never published to begin with that they had held back, and that was a cause of a lot of anger amongst the supporters of independent journalism, that they did hold back these batches and batches of files. So I agree, and I think that I hope that our audience is very well aware of that difference, the way in which the Intercept went about that process versus the way in which WikiLeaks operates.
Exactly.
And the Intercept is supposed to be independent. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, and if you remember when Julian said something like, I don't really think that there should be a curator in between the information and the public, he was attacked. He was attacked by Snowden himself, and he was attacked also by Glenn Greenwald. So, no, we need, we have to have curator. Well, this is what happens when now you have a curator. Now it's been completely closed down. And so, we're not going to find this out. So that's the point. I mean, if you are going to have somebody who's going to decide how much of this we'll release for you, well, the end result is we don't find out, what was really in this archive.
What do you have any, before we try and bring Anne back in again, do you have any thoughts on what may have motivated the Intercept to remove the documents now of all times? I mean, is there any issue that is pressing that could have sort of impacted their hosting of these documents?
I mean, I was always under the assumption that Omidyar was never that enthusiastic about doing this. So I don't know what right now may have triggered this. But I mean, my assumption all along has been that, Omidyar just wanted to co-opt a kind of, liberal leftist journalist, give him a certain credibility, but he didn't really want to rock the boat. So I think he just, wanted to essentially do fairly kind of, mainstream kind of liberal journalism. He had Glenn Greenwald there, who's really his front man. So so if you say, well, this is somebody who's adversarial, and he is adversarial. He's a genuine article. So he had Greenwald there, but the rest of it, the Intercept, I mean, I find really rather uninteresting.
It's a shame and a missed opportunity because the kind of flagship issue of the Intercept at its founding, as I understand it, was the Snowden files. So for them to
that's exactly what it was. Yeah.
It's a huge shame. So, but on that kind of uncheery note, I'll try to bring Anne in again. Hopefully, it will be successful this time. Hi, can you hear us? I can't unmute you, so you'll have to unmute yourself if you can hear me.
Computer audio.
Okay, there you are.
There I am.
Hi.
Okay. Hi.
Hey, Anne. How are you?
Yes. I'm a little under the weather, but I'm here anyway. That's my excuse for being late this time. I had only a couple of things to say. One is that I wrote a letter to Momentum, the sort of grassroots organization who got Jeremy Corbyn elected to head the Labour Party. And they didn't write back to me. And I don't really know why they would, because they've got plenty to deal with. So why would they write back to someone all the way across the pond and the continent? But I've been listening to George Galloway on his great radio show, Talk Radio. And he talked about Momentum a bit the last time that I listened to him. And, you know, he also said something I didn't know. I didn't know that he had been expelled from the Labor Party before the Iraq War. He said he was trying to get back in now. He'd applied. Yes. He'd applied to renew his membership.
Yes.
So I was hoping that sometime soon you can get George Galloway back here on the Vigil to talk about that, to talk about momentum and whether or not momentum has any leverage here.
Yeah, no, George is obviously an incredible contributor to the vigils and has come on before. And there are lots of panelists that we are looking forward to, you know, having with us soon. It's definitely a different scenario for us to be doing these vigils weekly versus monthly. But yeah, I'm hoping that you know, he and many others can join us as well. Do you have any sort of thoughts about the recent re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning due to her, taking a moral stand that she was not willing to back down from when it comes to the grand jury that is, looking to indict Julian Assange?
Well, one of my only thoughts is that more people here in the Bay Area are paying attention now, because Chelsea's a heroine, and a lot of people here were determined to try to get her out. There was a lot of energy behind that. I think I told you that he was once while he was still in prison, he was I called him he. He was still, she was still in prison, okay? She was still in prison, and they made her the honorary Grand Marshal of the Gay Pride Parade, which is probably the biggest gay pride parade in the country, if not the world. Now, what can, if there's any leverage there, I have to ask if there's anything beyond trying to get a lot of people on the phone. That there was one time I saw this kind of email, snail mail, telephone organization work, obviously. And that was when, who was going to do this? The Pentagon, the Pentagon Special Effects Department was going to blow up a huge bomb called Divine Strike, the conventional bomb, not a nuclear bomb, but it was a much larger conventional bomb than had ever been blown up. And they were going to do it at the Nevada test site, which means they would be stirring up all this radioactive material that would blow on what are called the downwinders in that part of the country, in the Colorado, Utah area.
Right.
And they had people write so many letters that they had to fill up an airplane. They filled up an airplane, and then a local newscaster who had been reporting on it flew to Washington with this airplane full of letters. And in that case, I've been drinking too much coffee, I'm allergic. In that case, people felt immediately threatened. And it's much easier to organize something like that when people feel immediately threatened.
Well, we know that there has been an ongoing effort by supporters of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, but specifically in the last year or so by supporters of WikiLeaks to help people and encourage people to write letters to human rights organizations and NGOs, as well as their local politicians, especially MPs in the UK. For British viewers, listeners, and supporters of Assange, that's a huge effort that is ongoing. For sure, that is important, that people should participate in if they haven't already. It's definitely one avenue, because a lot of viewers, in every single vigil will say, what can we do to help? Which is a great question. And that's one of the things people can do, is they can write letters to their representatives and make it very clear that this is an issue that they care about deeply. So.
Yeah. And I had considered trying to get some people together to make an appointment with Barbara Lee, who is our representative out here, who has taken a number of courageous stands, like voting against the Patriot Act. Although it's really hard to believe that we're going to get any help with this from any US Congress people.
Yeah.
But you know, we
particularly the Democrats who now really hate Julian Assange. So anything associated with Julian Assange, I think very few Democrats are on board to help out.
But it's possible that the LGBT community may be mobilized behind Chelsea, and you can't be mobilized behind Chelsea without being mobilized behind what she did.
Right.
Something else that I did this week when I was browsing on the WikiLeaks website, you know how if you get on the homepage and you click leaks, then you get batches of leaks with icons. And I was just scrolling through them and I came to one about corruption with regard to a federal law or program, whatever. It was supposed to employ disabled people. And it was federal funds to employ disabled people. But there'd been huge corruption with it. There was some company called Source America that was very, very involved, that has a very self-righteous website about all these things that it does for disabled people. And it turned out that a lot of corporations had been involved as well. Like they had used it in a way to hire staff and get the federal government to pay for it by hiring people who were just barely disabled. And there are a lot of things you can do, like taking a few psych meds to qualify as barely disabled. So I have a friend who produces a show called Pushing Limits, which is it's about pushing beyond your disability. And I sent that to her and said, I suppose you know all about this, right? She said, no, she'd never heard about it. And she sent it to her collective, her radio production collective, and they were going to think about whether or not they could produce any programming about it. So I think, and I had similar experience when I went through the diplomatic cables, and I went through the diplomatic cables for the African Great Lakes region, and I found a number that were really shocking about Rwanda. One in which whoever was the ambassador in Kigali at the time wrote that this is a really volatile situation. It is not a situation of ethnic reconciliation. It's a situation where a Tutsi minority is ruling brutally over a Hutu majority. And this is a tinderbox. And so when I wrote about that in the Black Agenda report, and then I sent it to my friends who are in the Rwandan diaspora in opposition, who I'm sure sent it on to Rwanda. Although there's so much surveillance there. Rwanda's like a developed country. It's like a developing country with a surveillance system that is like that of the United States or the UK. You can't go into a store without setting off all kinds of alarms about what you've got in your pockets.
Right. Well, that's definitely one of the issues that we've been talking about throughout today's, Vigil, is that there are so many different subjects that WikiLeaks documents cover and kind of enlighten us on years later, when at the time that they were published, WikiLeaks itself and the journalists covering the releases wouldn't have known that these particular documents would be relevant. And then years later, we have, people appointed to positions where the WikiLeaks documents kind of can illuminate their history and, or the United States history towards them, all sorts of different ways. And we've been talking about the kind of breadth of subjects that WikiLeaks kind of has informed us all on. And I think that's what you're talking about is a real example of that, for sure.
No, absolutely. It's an extraordinary historical archive. I mean, it's like, researchers for the coming decades are going to be relying on this. I mean, it's to know about the workings of the U.S. government, and which isn't available in, say, the public records. I mean, this is the actual cables. This is how they communicate among themselves, and now we know this. So this is a unique treasure And we were forever in Julian's debt that he's given this to us.
Well, I find
yeah. Go ahead, Anne. Go ahead.
Every time, am I up? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Every time I find something of interest to a particular community that perhaps has not been that aware of or interested in WikiLeaks, because the leaks that have gotten all the press are those that implicate the Pentagon in war crimes and crimes against humanity, or genocide, depending on how you define it. And I don't know of anyone else who took the time to read them about the Great Lakes region of Africa. Actually, I do. I do know one woman who wrote a book about Uganda and said she used what was there, what was available. And someone, a lawyer who was involved in defending, what's his name? The president of the Ivory Coast, who was swept off to the ICC. Laurent Gbagbo. Yeah. Laurent Gbagbo has been acquitted.
He was acquitted, yeah.
He was acquitted, but he's sort of still imprisoned at the ICC.
Well, that's what happens at these international courts. I mean, you're acquitted, and then the prosecutors have the right to appeal the acquittal, and so you stay in prison while the prosecutors appeal your acquittal. It's quite extraordinary.
There are a bunch of people who have been who have been acquitted by the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda and in the appeals process, and they're sort of stuck.
They're stuck, yeah.
They're stuck there because the propaganda all around the ICTR convinced the world that they were all monsters. So even though they've been acquitted, nobody wants them.
Oh yeah, right.
But so I mean, I plan to keep reading through the leaks, looking for leaks that might expand the community that haven't been talked about so much, like these about the corruption in Source One and the use of the intended use of federal funds to employ disabled people.
But again, today the U.S. denied visas to staff of the International Criminal Court. And so, because the International Criminal Court, they might be investigating Americans for possible prosecution. So basically, no visas, you can't come into the United States. And then the State Department issues this statement saying, well, we like hybrid courts. We don't like the International Criminal Court, but we've always supported these hybrid courts. So like the Rwanda Tribunal, Yugoslavia Tribunal. Yes, we support the courts that we control, finance, staff, make sure who the judges are, who the prosecutors are. We give them the remit. You are to investigate just what went on from this month of this year to that month of this year. And we like those courts. Those are the courts we will support. We won't support any court in which any American might be arrested for, or even, heaven forbid, convicted for. Those we're not going to support.
Well, there are documents. I think they're available on the ICC website. There are agreements between the U.S. and most every African country that they will not indict. They will not extradite one another's citizens.
Article 98 agreements, yeah.
And we also, and I mean, returning to just the overall publications that WikiLeaks has released, we know, and this is, again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I think it's worth repeating that there have been, I believe, when you look at Google Scholar, WikiLeaks comes up in what is now over, I believe, 48,000 documents, whether that is court cases, scholarly papers, and that type of thing. And it really, to me, begs the question, why are there not courses being offered in universities, either based on WikiLeaks' material in certain subjects or just based on WikiLeaks as a model overall? I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, but to me it seems like something that should be happening.
What you've just said is an excellent idea. I mean, I think I'll go and offer that as a course somewhere, because that's a brilliant suggestion. yeah, that's exactly what you could say. WikiLeaks and tribunals. I mean, there's a huge amount there, or anything, or WikiLeaks and Rwanda. I mean, there's any number of fields that one can open up. So that's a brilliant suggestion.
Yeah, I've thought. I mean, as I keep writing about individual WikiLeaks in the African Great Lakes region, it occurred to me that I could put these reports into a book. That would be WikiLeaks diplomatic cables from the Great Lakes region of Africa, which is the most conflict tortured part of the continent. I don't know if that would be a valuable thing to do, but it did occur to me that that could be done.
Right. No, that's right.
That's good.
Yeah, no, it's like the kind of thing the National Security Archive does. They publish certain documents that they've got via FOIA, on a regular basis, and often maybe 20 documents. But WikiLeaks actually provides a hell of a lot more than that. So you can easily publish books, or even sort of lengthy essays based entirely on WikiLeaks material.
They've got, the National Security Archive is in the habit of releasing things when it's too late to cause a fuss.
Yes.
Once, just a few years ago,
I know,
during the Christmas holidays, they released documents acknowledging that they had assassinated Patrice Lumumba.
Which everyone had known about for 50 years.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree. I mean, and they did that a couple of years ago about how George Bush kind of lied to the Russians about no NATO expansion to the east, which again, is hardly a great secret, but they did, they have a few documents to confirm what pretty much everybody had already known, that Gorbachev would lie to first by George Bush, and then Yeltsin was lied to by Clinton. So, but I mean, it's still a useful record, but sure, it is a little late.
Yeah, it's for the history books.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the infinitude of subjects that WikiLeaks documents cover means, whether it's on, books about the diplomatic cables in one country, or, the Vault 7 release, or whether it's about the DNC emails and what that revealed about the Democratic primary in 2016, any one of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of topics absolutely could be taught or written about in books, and it should be. Because otherwise what the whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning have done it isn't made of use unless people really consume that knowledge and put it to work somehow. So
go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to say something about the curation. I think I remember that Julian Assange said that if he didn't write these introductions to people about what they might be looking for, it was hard for them to approach them. It's hard for us to approach them. And I found that to be true. And it was only in a talk that he gave about the diplomatic cables when he said, well, people are going to see gaps. They're going to see gaps because we didn't have the top secret cables. So that was why the first time I looked into them, before I heard him say that, I thought, well, what's the significance of this? These are all around the edges of the real catastrophes. Like when the two African presidents, the Burundian and Rwandan president, were shot out of the sky over Rwanda, or during the first Congo War, especially the outset of the first Congo War. So since those are absent, and there had to be a flurry of diplomatic cables coming, that those must have been very, very top secret. Those cables embroider around the edges of the big conflicts. But I would not have known to look for that if I hadn't seen Julian Assange say that they didn't have the top secret cables, and so we should be looking for gaps like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, the one kind of difficulty, or I guess barrier to entry into looking at WikiLeaks, and something that could be addressed, would be, you know, I mean, the value of WikiLeaks is that it does not give you a narrative with which to interpret the documents that they publish. But that can also mean that people who don't have the time to actually consider what the primary source material is telling them, you know, may find that lack of context difficult, for sure. But I think that the fact that they don't kind of just create a narrative and spoon feed it to people is one of their greatest strengths, you know, as a scientific.
And they have a pretty good search engine. So
Yeah.
if you use the search engine, I mean, you're going to get an awful lot of great documents. So look, I mean, you've got, I mean, hundreds of thousands of documents. I mean, it's beyond the capability of anyone to sort of construct, you know, a narrative involving all of them. So you're kind of left to your own devices. But I mean, it is very well curated. I mean, as I say, I mean, that search engine is very useful.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and go ahead.
I was just going to say, it took me a little time to figure out how to use it efficiently, but yeah, it's very good.
Absolutely. So on that note, I believe that we're going to start wrapping it up for today. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you to all of the panelists who spoke with us today. We had, you know, Mary earlier, and James Cogan as well from the Socialist Equality Party. And, you know, thank you to everyone who not only watches these vigils, but also, you know, participated in the rallies in the last couple of weekends in Australia. So we'll be back next week. And, you know, Joe Lauria, obviously from Consortium News, will be here, as will I. And thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for continuing to host this, and it's a lot of work on your part, and you know, we're all extremely appreciative.
Yeah.
Well,
so
thank
you so much.
We're coming up on a year since Julian Assange was silenced, so I think it's just imperative that all of us continue to work to end that situation as quickly as possible.
What is the date which that happened? Do you know?
I believe it was March 28th. I believe was the day that he was, you know, gagged. So very, very soon it'll have been a year. So
okay,
all right.
Okay. Well,
So,
we'll have to mark that the March 20th, whatever it was. Yeah.
Okay, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.